Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the second episode of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. In this episode, we're going to meet a hero from my home country. The land I come from is often referred to as lo stivale, the boot, for its shape, or il bel paese, the beautiful country, for its many natural and artistic wonders. It is well known for its food and for its art, and it is as rich in history as it is in nature. I better stop here before I start to sound too much like a travel pamphlet rather than an historical guide, but I'm guessing I've given you enough information to figure out that our next destination is Italy. One could easily get lost in the myriad of historical paths that make out the underground of the country. History abounds in the peninsula, and even the most finicky traveller may find something to suit their tastes. Even those without a strong passion for history or art can find delightful details about the country that would, without a doubt, make you the star in a pub quiz. Are you curious about one? Well, why don't we talk about coffee? Contrary to what some of you may expect, Italy and the Italians are not the absolute biggest consumers of coffee in the world. That honour goes to Sweden, Norway and Finland, with an average of 9 to 10 kilos of coffee per person per year. That said, Italy's consumption rate is nothing to scoff at. We take an honourable fourth place with 6.7 kilos per coffee per person per year. Taking into consideration the fact that our consumption is almost exclusively done with espresso, that averages at around 14 billion espressos every year. Not bad, right? Italy has many other weird and intriguing records, along with the most World Heritage sites than any other country in the world. That number is currently sitting at 58, which puts Italy just above China and its 56 sites. So many visitors chose it as a travel destination that in 2023 it held the fourth spot in the entire world. What about a more historical kind of travel? There would be 1,001 paths that we could take to discover the many, many myths, legends and heroes of the Italian peninsula, from the Etruscans to the Romans up until the beautiful Renaissance. There would be material enough to make an entire series of this podcast simply dedicated to Italy and its history. And while that would be worthwhile on its own, this is not the scope of this podcast. It was difficult to choose just one single character to introduce to you in this episode, but then I realized that if we were to talk about Italy as a country, then there was one character, one path we needed to discover first. Roman history is really important for the Italian peninsula, but at the time of the Romans, Italy wasn't really a country, not in the sense we give to the world today. It was the very center of the empire, but its confines extended far beyond the Alps in the north and the seas in any other direction. The territory that we associate with Italy today has a millenarian history, one of the longest in Europe, but the country, Italy, is quite young. There are many paths which could lead us to the foundation of Italy, many stories we could look into, many heroes who have given their time, their money, and their lives for our Republic of Italy. All of them deserve our full attention and respect, but there is one in particular whom we Italians need to thank because, for better or for worse, he made Italy. You might have noticed from the title that our voyage today will not take us to our destination. I did choose one single hero to introduce to you, but looking into his life has made me realize that I could not just pluck him out from history and treat him like a single entity existing in the void. If I had, not only most of what I'd tell you would not make any kind of sense, but you'd also be missing out on the delightful details I promised to you in my introduction to the podcast. I still had to leave some things out, or I would have run the risk to bore you to death. But in order not to kill out the soul of the man who gave everything for freedom, I split his story in half. Today, my fellow travellers, I am proud to present to you Giuseppe Garibaldi, the hero of two worlds. I just know that some of you are scratching your heads in perplexed stupor. Why would I be talking about a biscuit of all things? If you come from the United Kingdom or have visited there, you might have come across the Garibaldi biscuit at tea time. The biscuits are made with a layer of currants squashed between two layers of dough and then baked until golden. The name wasn't chosen at random. The treat owes its name to the hero who had fought for freedom in half the known world. Sources are not in agreement on the day these biscuits first appeared on the market in England, but they were definitely invented as a tribute to Garibaldi in one of his 3 visits he made to the country. Most probably after his last and most famous visit in 1864. I don't want to hurt the feelings of English people or biscuit enthusiasts, but the first time I saw a Garibaldi biscuit, it didn't look particularly appetizing. I had heard that one of their most macabre nicknames was the Fly Biscuit, and I could see why the moment I clapped eyes on them. Still, even if they might not look it, they are a melt-in-your-mouth treat once you eat them. Legends on where John Carr took inspiration for this biscuit from are as abundant as they are varied. Some say they are inspired by the salty crackers of the sailors, which Garibaldi was known to love with a little bit of jam. Others, with a bit more malice, say that they were a commemoration of the one time in which Garibaldi accidentally sat on a necklace cake and squashed it. Hence the current look of the biscuits. We may never know the truth, but what matters is that the fame of Giuseppe Garibaldi, even outside of Italy, was so vast while he lived that he gave his name to a treat whose popularity still endures today. How did Giuseppe Garibaldi, a man of humble origins, become so famous that a country who owed him nothing celebrated him in such a way? I think we need to leave the pantry and start this story from the very beginning. Garibaldi Giuseppe was born on the 4th of July 1807 in Nice. While part of the Kingdom of Sardinia, the county of Nice in that moment was occupied by the French, and so, when our hero was born, he was registered as Joseph-Marie Garibaldi. He wasn't French, though, since both his parents hailed from Liguria. He spoke fluent French, a fact which would serve him well later in life. It is valuable to remember that while Garibaldi wasn't French, at this time he was also not Italian. He would become Italian only in 1861. His calling as a hero seemed to have started very early in life. There are many stories about him and his feats, most of which have been either completely invented or grossly exaggerated. But the sources seem to be in accord that he performed his first heroic act as he was 8 years old, when he saved a laundress from drowning. Saving people from gruesome deaths in the water seemed to be a constant in his life. At 13, he single-handedly saved some of his friends whose boat had tipped over, and at 27, heedless of both the fact that he was a wanted fugitive, so it would have been better for him to lay low, and that he was wearing his best finery, he jumped off the deck of a ship he was currently on, trying to escape the Savoy police, to save a young boy of just 14 years of age. His proximity to so many drowning accidents is not casual. While most people remember him as a soldier, the reality was that Garibaldi had started out as a sailor, and for most of his life it was the sea who gave him his greatest successes, both in war and in peace, especially since he resorted more often than not to sea trade to put something on the table. It was at sea that young Garibaldi found his purpose. His parents, like all parents, had wanted for him a great career. His eldest brother became consul in the USA later in life, and so they had tried to steer him towards either becoming a lawyer, a doctor, or a priest. Little Giuseppe, though, felt no inclination whatsoever towards such heavy paths. Per his admission, he was more inclined towards having fun rather than study. That isn't to say he was an ignorant, far from it. He spoke fluently at least 4 languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and he knew enough English to get by. He liked history, especially the ancient Roman one, and knew enough of math to be able to teach it. As a young man born under the reign of Napoleon, the life of a good Christian seemed a boring existence. As a teenager, young Giuseppe and friends wanted adventures, and when they were denied those by their parents, they decided to forge their own path. Garibaldi and 4 friends ran from home and made it until the Principality of Monaco before their escape was halted and they were forcibly brought back home. It was clear to his parents that little Giuseppe would never be the lawyer they had envisioned, and so it was with heavy heart that they acquiesced to his desires. He boarded his first ship, the Costanza, in 1824 as a deckhand. For 4 years, he sailed the European seas, going as far away as the port of Odessa. It wasn't an easy life, but it was full of those adventures he had always dreamed as a child. To these years, one could almost say formative years, Garibaldi owes the first 2 of his 9 arrests and his 3 encounters with Greek privateers. To take off a little bit of the legendary aura that seems to seep from his man even at a young age, let me tell you that he got arrested for the first time in Odessa due to drunken late-night disturbances, and the second time because he had brazenly broken the house arrest he had been placed into because of his drunken shenanigans. As for his encounters with the Greek privateers, let's just say that these didn't end up being the grand tales one would regale the friends with at dinner. The captains of all the ships Garibaldi was on during these encounters ordered the crew not to engage and let the privateers rob them blind. At 20-something, straining for a good fight, young Giuseppe had to endure being stripped to his underwear, and in a particularly humiliating experience also of his underwear, without being able to oppose any resistance. To these privateers, Garibaldi also owed his first wound. He would be wounded a grand total of 6 times in his life, which, considering the experiences he had, I'd say is a fairly small amount. I did mention that Garibaldi found his purpose at sea. Given that he had boarded his first ship at 16 and had obtained his qualification as captain just 8 years later, it would not be difficult to imagine that this could have been the entire life of this man. A successful sailor and captain, having adventures against privateers like he had always dreamt as a child. In the end, though, this was not the life Garibaldi chose. The sea brought him another, bigger purpose. In the spring of 1833, on a ship bound to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul in Turkey, Garibaldi met some followers of Henri de Saint-Simon, and his entire destiny changed. Or so the legend says. The French followers of Saint-Simonianism that Garibaldi met preached a world in which the industrial class, also called the working class, needed to be recognized and fulfilled to have an effective society and an efficient economy. They were pacifists, libertarians, and preached equality between classes and sexes. Oh, and also free love. They were not the first people Garibaldi had encountered who had preached on these themes, but it was this encounter that changed the direction of his story. Listening to them, Garibaldi became convinced that a true man was not bound to a single nation, but he was a citizen of the world. In his words, as given to us by Alexander Dumas, yes, the one of the Three Musketeers, Garibaldi said, "A man that becoming cosmopolitan takes the world as his own homeland and offers his sword and blood to every population that fights against tyranny is more than a soldier, is a hero." From this point on, Garibaldi would build himself a career of hero serving all of humanity. It is not just to the Saint-Simonianism ideals that Garibaldi owes his new beliefs and his future fame. There is another fateful encounter for our hero in the year 1833, this time in Marseille. I've introduced Giuseppe Garibaldi as the hero behind the foundation of Italy as the country we know and love today. But until now, nothing I've told you really bound him to the peninsula. Which is historically correct. At this moment, there is no Republic of Italy to speak of. To be fair, there is no Italy at all. The meeting in 1833 is the starting point to change all of this. In Marseille, Garibaldi met a notorious fugitive by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini. It feels somewhat disrespectful to describe Mazzini as such, but it is the truth. He had been arrested 3 years before in Genova because he was part of the secret society of the Carbonari, whose main objective was to defeat the Austrian tyrants in Italy and unify the peninsula as a republic. Since they were operating outside the law and directly against the established powers, all of the members were branded as criminals. Mazzini had been able to evade arrest and was living as a fugitive in Marseille. In theory, nobody should have known where he was. In practice, there was such a long line outside his door that everyone and their mother knew where to find him. Garibaldi approached the meeting with the clear awe of a young, idealistic person ready to give his life for the cause. Mazzini, older and more pragmatic, looked for new recruits. As most stories go, it was distaste at first sight. Garibaldi thought Mazzini cantankerous and intractable, and Mazzini thought Garibaldi vulgar and ignorant. It could have gone worse. They weren't to know it in that moment, but the two of them would meet over and over during the following decades. Still, for all they didn't like each other, Garibaldi was fascinated by the political ideals, and he sided with the political organization that Mazzini had founded, the Giovine Italia. Embroiled in a failed revolt in 1834 in Piemonte, Garibaldi was condemned to death by the Savoy dynasty and forced to flee. he went back to his first love, ships, and after a couple of years in Tunisia, he set sail for Rio de Janeiro. Yes, I know he's supposed to be an Italian hero, and I told you that the scope of this podcast would encompass Europe, but please bear with me. He is going to come back, I promise. The years in South America are rich in valuable experiences for Garibaldi, but very poor of information for us. The entire continent was in an ebullient state of warfare in that moment. Small and big states fighting against each other and against external forces for their freedom. For the man who had vowed to take up arms in help of humanity, this was exactly the situation he had been looking for. It is because of situations like this one that Garibaldi is known to posterity as a simpleton, a bit of a sap who took up every cause as long as it was pitiful enough. Such a description, though, is as far away from the truth as it can possibly be. It is true that in those years, wherever there was a revolt, Garibaldi was there to lend his aid. But he didn't do it because he was a warmongering brute. To define him as such is to completely misunderstand his character. For all that he seemed to have participated in every war fought in the 19th century, his political positions about war were clearly against it. He was against militarism, and when he started fighting his battles in the newly elected Italian parliament, he pushed for cuts to the military budget and for the creation of an army that would run only on a voluntary basis. Why, though, a man who clearly wanted peace spent half of his life at war, becoming an officer in no less than 6 different armies? The first half of the 19th century is, for most of the Western world, and I mean Europe and both sides of the American continent, a period of change, of revolution. The old regimes which had stood strong until that moment were crumbling underneath the pressures of the people, who were sick and tired of being always crushed under the heels of the nobles. The time was ripe for a government of the people, for the people. This was the reason behind Garibaldi's every fight. He was a Republican, and a nationalist, and a patriot, and where there were people willing to fight for their freedom, he wanted to be there, next to them, helping along. For him, freedom was a universal concept, and it mattered little that he was fighting for a nation that technically wasn't his own. I say technically because by the end of his life, he had become citizens of at least 5 different countries. Contemporaries and posterity have always thought ill of him, describing Garibaldi as a naive visionary who enlisted himself in a cause without really understanding it. They thought him fanatic and volatile, in for the money and the thrill. If one were to look at facts, though, the first thing that becomes clear is that Giuseppe Garibaldi was neither naive nor fanatic. He might have been a visionary, though, because he envisioned a world where people were free. And he definitely wasn't in for the money. Every cause Garibaldi gave his soul to was a cause rooted in freedom. Later in life, when he had gone back to Italy to help free the people, he declared that he was willing to lay down his life if the objective of the war was liberation. But if Italy were to oppress other people in war, then he would not hesitate in taking up arms against his country. As for the money, he wasn't as poor as his myth would make us believe. He did buy half of the island of Caprera, which, for all that it isn't big, it's not exactly tiny. But he also never did take up arms for just a paycheck. His first foray into the cause of freedom had led him to flee for his life from Europe to South America. His second experience didn't end much better. He chose to fight for the Rio Grandense Republic, often called the Piratini Republic, which was a state seceded from the Empire of Brazil and roughly coincides today with the Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul. I'm sorry to spoil you the end, but the state is still in Brazil even today because they did lose their independence war. Garibaldi was young and still inexperienced, but he was a good sailor, and so, in 1838, he was given the lofty title of privateer for the state, due to the fact that he possessed one single ship, which wasn't even a warship, but a fishing boat that was later rejiggered for combat. Not one to be deterred by lack of means, Garibaldi made do, and managed to score a victory and capture a brigantine and his cargo of coffee. It was clearly more than the brass had been expecting, and it led to a promotion for our captain. He became the commander of the navy, with a grand total of 3 ships, which I know doesn't sound much, but it was a 200% increase on what he had before. Still, increase or not, it was patently clear that the rebels weren't going to win the war. And when Garibaldi saw that things had delved into a civil war and not a war for freedom anymore, he asked and obtained permission to leave the army and went away. He didn't go very far. The place he called home for the following years was Montevideo in Uruguay, where, to make ends meet, since as I said he didn't fight for the money and he hadn't been paid for his efforts in the previous war, he started to teach math. Before we go any further though, allow me to guide you on a smaller side path. While in South America, Garibaldi didn't just find his calling, he also found the love of his life. She is best known as Anita Garibaldi, and I, for one, really thought that Anita was a birth name. In reality, she was born Ana Maria de Jesus Ribeiro da Silva. What we know now has been heavily dipped into legend and myth, but even if a smidge of what has been written is truth, Anita Garibaldi has more than earned her place as a heroine. She was born in Brazil, in a family barely skirting the edge of poverty. Being the third of 10 children, as soon as she turned 14, her mother forced her to marry a much older man in order not to wait on the family finances. In the 3 years in which little Anita was forced to live with Manuel Duarte, she was forced to endure many abuses, until one day her husband decided to join the Imperial Army and she was left behind. Finally free from her oppressor, young Anita enjoyed her freedom but yearned for more. Her blood was boiling at the thoughts of the insurrections happening all over the country, and she wanted to participate in the fighting as well. Her occasion came in July 1839, when she was walking on a beach with some other young maidens. On his lonely fishing boat turned war vessel offshore, Giuseppe Garibaldi turned his spyglass towards the shore, and, so he says in his memoirs, the first time he saw her, he was immediately fulgurated. Unfortunately, we're not privy to what Anita thought of him once he came to shore, but considering she abandoned everything to sail away with him, I think we can safely say that it was love at first sight for the both of them. From this point on, her life is even more adventurous than her husband's. Her baptism of fire came on the 3rd of November 1839, just a few months after she had sailed away from her unfortunate marriage. Her husband was still missing at the time, when, during a naval battle, she was the first to fire the cannons against the Brazilian Navy. Not even 15 days later, she risked her life in another naval battle, running under the barrage of the cannons to steal the enemy's ammunition from their ships before Garibaldi burned them. She was always near him. Some say because she shared his beliefs, some others because she was extremely jealous, even in battle. And so, in 1840, in the Battle of Curitibanos, she was taken prisoner. Having heard that Her José, how she would always call Garibaldi, had fallen in battle, she begged to be allowed to search for his body. Not finding him amongst the dead, she held out hope that he was alive, so she stole a horse and fled, until she was finally able to reunite with him. Some month later, just 12 days after she had given birth to her and Garibaldi's first son, Menotti, she was forced to flee for her life. The soldiers in the Brazilian Imperial Army had surrounded the house where Garibaldi had left her and their newborn son, while he was away fighting, killing the guards that had been left to protect them. Knowing that she would be killed if captured, Anita strapped the little Menotti to her breast, jumped out of the window, and, on another horse, fled as fast as she could in the forest. She remained there for 4 days with no food, until Garibaldi and his men found and rescued them both. She was a force to be reckoned with, sharing Garibaldi's beliefs and struggles. When he decided that it was better for them to leave the struggles in Brazil and move on to Uruguay, she followed him without question, helping him making ends meet, working as a seamstress while he taught in a private school. It was in Montevideo that 3 years after they met, Giuseppe and Anita were married. If any of you is thinking this is the romantic coronation of their earth-shattering love for each other, don't let me stop you. Although you should know that they did tie the knot for a more prosaic and pragmatic reason. Uruguay had started its own independence war against Argentina, and Garibaldi, being Garibaldi, had immediately offered up his sword. Once again, he had been offered command of the navy, a proper navy this time, but there was a law in Uruguay which stated that those who aspired to be civil servants needed to be married. There was still a small problem of Anita's husband, but since he had never reappeared, both Anita and Garibaldi declared him dead and buried, and so they were free to marry. In truth, at the time of the declaration, neither of them knew for sure that Anita's husband was truly dead. Interestingly enough, we still don't know what happened to him after he joined the Brazilian army. So, once again, we see Garibaldi on the front lines to fight for freedom. This time Anita mostly contented herself with working as a field nurse, even though she did participate in the Battle of Sant' Antonio, where her newly wedded husband and his 190 men and 1 woman prevailed over 1,500 enemy soldiers. Garibaldi's fame and prowess in the field was so renowned on both sides of the fight that the Argentinians sent an envoy whose only objective was to offer the gringo, as Garibaldi was known, the astronomical sum of $30,000 just to switch sides. In today's money, they offered him more or less $1,200,000. What do you think Garibaldi did? Yeah, he refused them. According to the envoy writing back to the Argentinian dictator, he had refused anything and everything that had been offered to him. The fight of the Argentinians was not for freedom, so Garibaldi and Anita, who never complained about the loss of such a hair-raising amount of money, was not going to pledge his sword to them. Garibaldi would not stay until the end of the war, which concluded itself with Uruguay's victory in 1851. In the year 1848, another cause called him back to Europe. The King of Sardinia and Piedmont, Carlo Alberto I, had granted his territories a constitution, the Albertine Statute, and had gone to war with the Austrians with the objective of freeing Lombardy and Veneto. It was the revival of the cause for freedom Garibaldi had embraced almost 15 years before, when he had met the fugitive Mazzini in Marseille and had joined his Giovine Italia. This was the fight that Garibaldi had been waiting for. He really was a citizen of the world, and he really did believe in giving freedom to all people fighting for it. But to fight for Italy was to fight for his motherland. On the 4th of July 1848, already a hero in the New World and globally famous for it, Giuseppe Garibaldi met King Carlo Alberto I in Rovarbella and offered him his services. The rest, as they say, it's history. What happened next, though, we're going to see in the next episode. As I told you at the beginning, I debated whether or not it would have been better to just cut and condense this story to fit one single episode. But as I was writing it, I realized that I couldn't. There is so much of Garibaldi's story, of Anita's story, that I, as a student, had never even heard about, exactly because someone thought it would have been better to just prune down their lives so they could fit in a paragraph. I didn't want to do that to you, my fellow travellers. I hope you agree with me, and I will wait for you next time, when, finally back in Italy, we'll see just how much Garibaldi has done and lost for the sake of his country. I thank you all, my fellow travellers, for your attention. If you've liked this episode and want to know more, please hit the subscribe button. All the research has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. I will see you all in 2 weeks, where we'll see this story through its end. Goodbye, everyone. Safe travels.